when I think about how we should be communicating in the political world, and especially how Democrats ought to be communicating in the electoral arena, I think a lot. I turn a lot to our next guest, whose opinion I trust a great deal. Anat Shenker-Osorio is a communication specialist, a communication expert. She's a researcher, she's a political commentator, and a lot of organizations and politicians that you guys probably support listen to her and seek out her advice. She also has a book called Don't Buy It: The Trouble with Talking Nonsense About the Economy. And as you know, we are all about not buying what they tell us about the economy here on this program. She joins us now. And first of all, as always, Anat, thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So here's the thing that's been on my mind a lot lately. For you and I and others have been like banging our heads, sort of metaphorically speaking, perhaps literally, about the fact that Democrats seem to play too nice. In the old bringing a knife to a gunfight analogy, that it's more like the adversary has a bazooka at this point, or a flamethrower, and everybody seems to be on the Democratic side, or too many people seem to be worried about being genteel, being courteous, being polite. And now the Republicans have just gone thermonuclear with Donald Trump coming in and upending all of those old rules. And yet Democrats still seem to be worried about being too nice, which was why it was almost a therapeutically healthful experience for me to see your recent column in The Hill. They gave it the heading, or you did, Dems worry too much about upsetting others. That needs to stop. So let's start with this. Do Democrats worry too much about upsetting other people?
Yeah, it wasn't my headline, and perhaps not the headline I would have given it, but regardless, in my view of the world, and that is a view that to the extent possible is guided by empirical data, the way that we look at what counts as a quote unquote winning message, and I think that it's useful to know this because it ends up being where the rubber hits the road, where these conversations go from being sort of philosophical, who are you trying to target, to actually practical, are you going to pick message A, are you going to pick message B? So typically the way that Democrats decide this is our winning message is the message that performs the best in the overall sample. So if you have a sample of, let's say, 1,500 voters, and you are saying whatever gets the highest score in the overall sample, that's my winner, regardless of whether it's scoring well with my staunch opposition, whether my base is sort of grudging about it or enthused. To me, that's a fundamental misapprehension of the way that people come to political judgments. It's sort of, for those of you, the listeners who are familiar with the hot dog vendor problem, it's sort of assuming that people are going to come to the political ideology that seems closest to them. But in fact, we know that's not how people's brains work. In fact, the way that people's brains work is that we identify with social cues in our environment, commonly called anchoring effects, and we make assessments about where a certain message lies, where a certain ideology is, based upon what's to the left or right of it. So in seeking to always moderate and take what I would call take the temperature as opposed to change the temperature, right, and say, oh, we're going to say X because that's where the majority of people are. Well, where the majority of people are sucks. And it's not, in fact, our job to be a thermometer. It's our job to be a thermostat. So what we need to understand is where are people capable of going, supported by the right words and ideas.
So, I think that's extremely well put. And, what comes to mind in terms of I love your analogy of the thermometer versus the thermostat. Partially because I think it's a great analogy, and also because the thermostat never gets inserted into the human body, so it makes me more comfortable. But I kind of I'm going to refer back and as a conflict note, also mention that I was the writer for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, so I may be biased in the sense, but to a certain extent, I think whether you agree with Bernie on policy or not, he was a great example of the thermostat effect in that he was saying things that hadn't been said before. So nobody would have, for example, before he came along, and Elizabeth Warren and a couple of others, nobody in a poll would have said, I believe the game is rigged against ordinary working people. But once somebody said it, it resonated with millions of listeners, and it changed the equation. It changed the temperature instead of taking the temperature. And again, without getting into the policy differences, I mean, I happen to support him, of course, but without getting into the policy differences, isn't that what we're talking about here?
Yes. And more broadly, we're talking about which frame are you trying to activate in people, right? So I'm sure your listeners are familiar with the new, it's not so new anymore, shiny object called narrative shift, and all the funders are interested in narrative shift, and that's where all sort of the energy and interest lies. I actually think that that's an unhelpful way of thinking about it. I think that it's really more narrative activation, because what we know of people is that we function through these competing stories of, quote unquote, the way the world works and what is common sense. And so we have to ask ourselves, which version of the narrative does our message activate? And if you'll allow it, I'll give you a specific example.
Sure.
So one can argue that we ought to raise the minimum wage by saying correctly that raising the minimum wage, especially in a consumer-driven economy like ours, will circulate more money, right? Get average people money in their pockets, and it will grow the economy. That is a true statement. It's an argument you can make. It's an argument people do make. What that argument reaffirms is that the objective, the correct public policy objective, is to, quote, grow the economy, that it is our job to make the economy larger. Now, if you happen to believe in climate change, which I do, one could argue that saying that the objective is growing the economy ought to be malpractice, messaging malpractice. But even without that additional layer, do we want to really reaffirm the position that, yes, we agree the name of the game is who loves the economy best, and now we'll argue about the details, versus saying the reason to raise the minimum wage, as the Fight for 15 rightly has, is people who work for a living ought to earn a living, right? Why is the return on work so low at these places? Why are they confiscating so much money? Our families can't survive, right? This is not enough. This is not what our families need. So that's a fundamentally different story to activate, right? One is activating the story that we all agree that our job is to serve the economy, and now we'll get into the details about how you do that, versus, no, the economy's job is to serve us. It's a construct. It's simply a way of measuring human activity. And now let's argue about the correct way to meet people's needs.
Right. I think that's a fantastic point. And, it reminds me of a political science maxim from, many years ago where they used to say it about the media. It's also true about politicians, I would argue, and other spokespeople, which is that they can't tell you what to think, although I think now they can. But the point was they can't tell you what to think, but they can tell you what to think about. So if you frame your argument for the Fight for 15 in terms of it grows the economy, then you're thinking about growing the economy. You're not thinking about a world so you're not, as you say, you're not incorrect, but you're thinking about the wrong thing, and you're on the wrong playing field, aren't you? Because you're not making the fundamental argument, which is, hey, if you work full time, you ought to be able to get by in life.
Right. And I can give you another illustration. There was a campaign here in California where I live to repeal this sort of Gordian knot of all horrible policy, the maximum family grant, which essentially holds that the poorest of the poor who are eligible for food aid, food stamps, WIC, if they have a subsequent child after their first child, they're not eligible for that aid unless they prove that they were on long-acting contraception that failed or that they were raped. So sort of every horrible idea anyone's ever had.
Right.
It's been repealed here, but it exists in many states. So they wanted, as their repeal campaign, to run a invest in California's families. And I'm sorry, but what it boils down to give food stamps to a second or third child is maximum around $50 a month. That's not an investment. right? Food is not an investment. We do not feed children because we cannot wait to cha-ching on that sweet ROI, right?
Right,
You
right. The
feed children
dividends are
'cause
going to
that's
be awesome, right? It's not like we're expecting a dividend check at the end of the month if we do it. That's not what it's about. It's about
right.
kids not starving.
So the coalition went in and they met with a sympathetic legislator who said, and rightly so, I'm confused by this proposal you all have to repeal this because there's actually no research, there's no evidence that giving a little bit of money to the poorest of the poor takes them off of sort of government aid. Whereas this other proposal, which was it was a tweak to the earned income tax credit, so it targeted people just at the poverty line as opposed to really, really, really dire straits. We actually have seen research that shows that there's a return on this investment. And they all came out totally despondent. And I said, she's right. You told her to think of this as an investment. It's a terrible investment. It's not an investment. And so the much more powerful frame was, I believe all children have rights. Why is California preferring the firstborn? It was sibling rivalry. There were so many things to do with sibling rivalry, right?
That's
It can
so
get
interesting.
biblical, Cain and Abel,
Right.
Jacob stealing the birthright. If you're talking to legislators in the Central Valley, it can be funny with the mom. I happen to have 2 kids, doing the backseat. I'm going to pull this car over kind of business.
My parents
Why?
always preferred my older brother too, by the way. So really that resonates with me.
We had you in mind.
You're right. Thank you. So no, I think it's so important, and I think in terms of your piece in the Hill, and in terms of the Democrats and what's going on now, it still seems to me as if they haven't gotten this lesson as a party. And I'm not trying to beat up on them, but there are certain segments of the party, I think, that are just, for one thing, it's a different way of looking at language. It's a cognitive shift in the way you look at language. And I think that that's just something that we all need from time to time. We need to expand our vision, our way of looking at things. So I love it for the opportunity for myself to engage, and grow and change. But I also think there's an element in this as Disraeli said in the gendered language of his time, you cannot teach a man to learn what it's in his economic interest not to learn. Or I forget the exact phrase, but is there something like that going on with the Democratic Party too, where they don't want to change messaging because it might harm funding sources? I mean, you mentioned third way, for example, in your Hill piece, and I should preface my remarks there by saying they won't come on the show anymore. They're not unhappy with things I've written about them, so I don't want you to get involved in my friction with them or anything. But aren't there just some people who just because of funding or ideology just aren't open to a change in messaging?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, there's like a pretty well-fed consultant class of folks who make a living telling politicians, telling the Democratic establishment that, no, you can just sort of triangulate or white working class your way or whatever the new permutation on it is to victory. So that's part of it. And then part of it is actually at a more genuine, uglier level, I would say, which is that, some Democrats actually don't want to fight for 15. Right? It's not even that they reject a messaging that is rooted in what humans need as opposed to economic growth. They actually disagree with the policy prescription, right? Because they aren't actually that progressive and their money comes from the same sources as the Republicans. So that's certainly some of it. But then I think that there's also just a lot of fear among the people who do share, at least to some extent, our more progressive policy prescriptions. I think it's terrifying. We've had a shellacking and people revert to comfort. They revert to type, even though that makes absolutely no sense. If people made sense, I wouldn't have a job, right? A lot of my work is like, here is why people are actually doing the opposite of what seems logical. The interesting thing about the pattern in the research projects that I've done, I would say, at least for the last 3 years, is that the primary impediment that we have in our messaging is not actually that people think our ideas are wrong. I'm not talking about the consultant class. I'm talking about sort of a more general public.
Right.
It's not that people think that our ideas are wrong. It's that they think our ideas are impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, they agree. We should have gun control, huge numbers, but they're like, that's never going to happen. So I might as well get a gun myself since all the crazies will. And they believe that it would be better if we funded schools with a measure of equity and gave students that had been the longest ignored and sidelined more so that they actually had the same opportunity. But since they think that's never going to happen, they need to hoard all their tax dollars so that they can go to private school, right? They do actually prefer our policies. It's not that our main opposition is actually our opposition's ideas. It's cynicism.
You know, I think
And
that's
so,
yeah, go ahead. Sure. Finish your thought.
So a lot of the messaging challenge that we see actually is around a knee-jerk progressive tendency to lead with the problem, right? What I like to call, this is the Titanic. Would you like to buy a ticket? Or, you know, boy, have I got a problem for you, right? The climate is being destroyed.
Right.
Donate to this, right? There's a war on women. Come do that. And the thing is that most people, they don't want more problems. They got 99 problems and they don't want ours.
Right, right. And so, you know, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up. But I guess then, so the big challenge is, you know, just to sum it up, and then we'll have like 20 seconds. But it sounds like the big challenge is basically how do we present our ideas in a way that says, and we can do this.
Yeah. Yeah. And not just, and we can do this, but actually what I like to call messaging from inevitability, that this is a matter not of if, but when. And I think that the sort of paragon that exemplifies this is marriage equality. When they stopped focusing in on people are very upset about this and it's an abrogation of rights and our rights, and we have a big opposition, and basically pivoted to love and relationships, but also we're getting married, people. That's what's happening.
Right.
This is the future.
Right.
You can get on the bus or you can be left explaining to a grandchild why you had a problem.
Right.
We need to make it so that we need to stop telling people we're the losing team, because nobody wants to be on the losing team.
No, I love the message of inevitability. I think that's got to work. It's inevitably going to work. So unfortunately, we have to leave it there. But Anat Shenker-Osorio, communications expert, as always, great to talk to you, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much.